Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. Sanctions on Russia are definitely working. Sure, the ruble might be stronger now than before the war in Ukraine, but ignore that. And that painful rising inflation in the West has nothing to do with the sanctions. As for the global South countries refusing to join in on those anti-Russia sanctions, their silly leaders have either been manipulated by Kremlin propaganda or they're nefarious authoritarian Putinists. There's no other explanation. And rising global food insecurity, that too is Russia's fault. Sanctions on one of the world's biggest producers of gas, fertilizer, and grain is totally unrelated. Also, the US is a pristine democracy. China and all America's other adversaries are not. If you disagree with any of this, you might be part of a Russian-influenced disinformation operation, possibly even Chinese-influenced. At least that's what corporate media, weapons-funded think tanks, and Western officials are telling us. But is any of it actually true? Here to discuss the sanctions blowback on the West, as well as the narrative management surrounding it, is Arnaud Bertrand, a commentator on economics and geopolitics based in Shanghai. Arnaud, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much for joining me. I'm so excited to speak to you about all these very interesting topics. I guess a good place to start is perhaps the piece that you wrote for Tablet, which has kind of been making the rounds. It's received, people have been discussing it. It's received a little bit of, controversy as well. It's called, "Is America the Real Victim of Anti-Russia Sanctions?" And of course, I'll link to it in the description to this video. But in this piece, you argue that by trying to isolate Russia, and actually China as well, but mostly Russia here in the case of the war with Ukraine, the West may actually be isolating itself. So can you elaborate a bit on what you meant by that?
Sure. So first of all, it's interesting to look at this in terms of population, because the West, in the West, I include countries that always align with the West, like Japan or South Korea, for instance. They collectively represent only about 13% of the world's population. China and Russia together is 20%. So all of those together is 33%. So it leaves about 2/3 of the world population. And in those 2/3, we have absolutely major countries like India, Brazil, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and so on and so forth. And what are those countries doing? Are they siding with the West on their crusade against Russia and China? Well, a good indication is which of those countries followed the West in applying the sanctions on Russia. And the answer is virtually none of them. And same thing with China. We had another sign of this, I think it was 2 days ago, when the Netherlands led a joint statement at the UN on the human rights situation in Xinjiang. We had only 47 signatories among 193 member states at the UN. And again, almost exclusively Western countries, with a few rare exceptions. But India didn't sign, Brazil didn't sign, South Africa didn't sign, and quite tellingly, not a single Muslim country signed, except for Albania, but it's in Europe, so I guess it doesn't count. In fact, Muslim countries are vocal supporters of China on the Xinjiang question. For instance, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which gathers all the Muslim states and is the second largest international organization after the UN, even adopted a resolution which, I quote, commends China for its treatment of Muslims. So anyhow, what this all shows is that in terms of population, the West is in fact a relatively isolated minority that really only speaks for itself. It's not followed by a huge majority of the planet. And then looking at it in economic terms, that's also interesting. Look at what the sanctions on Russia are doing, for instance, on gas prices. They are skyrocketing in the West, but interestingly, they're not skyrocketing everywhere. While the West today pays $120 a barrel for oil, India, for instance, is securing oil at $75 a barrel with Russia. So concretely, what this means is that the West is making itself less competitive versus some of its world competitors, which concretely that means they're isolating themselves economically by making themselves less competitive. And it's the same dynamic with China. The US keeps applying sanctions on Chinese companies for various reasons. So Huawei, because it's supposedly a security threat, Hikvision, because it supplies surveillance cameras in Xinjiang, and so on and so forth. But what this does is that bit by bit, Western companies are cutting themselves off from key Chinese suppliers on key technologies like 5G. And again, this comes at a cost. It makes them less competitive because other companies in the rest of the world don't have such limitations. And again, in effect, this increasingly isolates them economically from the rest of the world.
But you also made this really amazing point in your piece as well. And I'm just going to quote you here. You write, seldom has the West so grossly misjudged an economy's global significance. And then you go on to detail how Russia and China are able to survive this Western economic warfare because unlike Western countries, China and Russia are these like commodities powerhouses with economies that are actually far that have a way higher value than the West even understands because of the sorts of things that they produce. Well, the West, on the other hand, the value of many of these Western economies is so inflated because they're so heavy on the tech and finance sectors and the service sector, whereas Russia and China are producing things that you need for shelter, or that you need for to actually like fuel an economy, literally oil and gas in the case of Russia, or things that you need to eat like wheat and grain in the case of Russia. So can you maybe explain the true value of economies like Russia and China and how, even unlike countries like Iran or Venezuela, like you can't just cut them off so easily from the global supply chain?
Sure. So first of all, credit where credit is due. My article is largely based on the thoughts of a French economist called Jacques Sapir, who is a very renowned specialist of the Russian economy. I should precise that I'm not myself an economist. So what Sapir says is that while we used to think of Russia as a small, irrelevant economy, many people used to say that it had the size of like Italy or Spain. Well, we totally misjudged the size of the Russian economy. And for Sapir, one big reason for this miscalculation is exchange rates. So if you compare Russia's GDP by simply converting it from rubles into US dollars, you indeed get an economy the size of Spain's. But such a comparison makes no sense without adjusting for purchase power parity, the famous PPP, which most economists agree is the only sensible way to compare two economies. And when you measure Russia's GDP based on PPP, when you do that adjustment, it's clear that Russia's economy is actually more like the size of Germany's. So already it's not Spain or Italy. But then there is something else, like you were saying in your question. What Sapir thinks, and I agree with him, the service sector today is very much overvalued compared with the industrial sectors and commodities like oil, gas, copper, agricultural products, and so on and so forth. This makes intuitive sense. When push comes to shove, we know there is much more value in providing people with the things that they really need to survive, like food and energy, than there is in services like Netflix or spending
Right.
spending a weekend in the country. So I like Game of Thrones, but if I have the choice between watching it or starving, it's pretty clear what I will choose, right? So if we reduce the proportional importance of services in the global economy, Sapir says that Russia's economy is in fact vastly larger than Germany, and represents maybe 5 or 6% of the world's economy. So there was a huge misunderstanding of the size of the Russian economy. And for fun, what I did is I applied the same reasoning to the Chinese economy. So first of all, few people know that when you correct for PPP, China's economy is already overtook the US 6 years ago, and now it's already almost 20% larger than the US. And this gets even more dramatic when you do that adjustment for the share of the service sector versus the industrial commodities sector. The US is a service-based economy, but China, even more than Russia, is all about manufacturing and industry. And when you adjust for this, it's likely that the Chinese economy is in fact as much as 50 or maybe even 60% bigger than the US today. So yes, those two economies are in fact very large, and they've become like real linchpins to the world economy. So it's a whole different ball game from say like Venezuela or Iran.
Yeah, and just to add to some of what you're saying, even we saw today that today that we're recording, that Bloomberg was reporting that White House officials are privately admitting that what they're calling collateral damage from their own sanctions has had this way wider impact than they expected, particularly the sanctioning of food and energy, which they thought for some reason would have minimal effect on inflation. But of course, we see inflation in the US, which was already rising, is now kind of becoming out of control and is threatening to cause some sort of recession. But you also noted in your piece that the US-led West today is actually in a weaker position than it was during the first Cold War, back in the 50s and so on. Why is that? Why is it in a weaker position today?
Well, at the start of the first Cold War, the US was very much the manufacturing behemoth of the world. But that's not the case today. Today, that role is fulfilled by China, and to a lesser extent, Russia when it comes to energy and commodities. We often forget that Russia is actually the world's largest exporter of oil, even ahead of Saudi Arabia. Many people don't know that. So if you place yourself in the shoes of the leader of a sensible country, you have like this new Cold War going on, and you need to decide which camp you're going to join. And there is one camp that manufactures virtually all the essential goods that your people need to survive, and your energy, your fertilizers, the commodities that feed your own industry, and so on and so forth. On the other side gives you Netflix and Facebook. So, right? So it's not exactly a hard choice. But then there is something else that's crucially important. I'm not sure if you remember the so-called long telegram written by George Kennan, a US official at the beginning of the first Cold War, in which he detailed the US strategy for the Cold War. An essential ingredient of his strategy was what he called the spiritual vitality of the US and the West in general. He wrote, and I quote him here, the United States needs to create among the peoples of the world generally the impression of a country which knows what it wants, which is coping successfully with the problems of its internal life and with the responsibilities of a world power, and which has a spiritual vitality capable of holding its own among the major ideological currents of the time. And where is that spiritual vitality today? Spiritually speaking, the West is in the worst place it's been in for maybe 200 years. And it's critically important. It's impossible to win a war of influence without this. So all this to say that it would be an immense mistake by the West to launch a new Cold War today. It's arguably already done so, but it needs to reverse course because it's virtually guaranteed that it won't pan out like the first one did. And it's also beyond insane to have a Cold War when the world has never faced such serious global challenges like climate change or pandemics, which, by definition, because they're global, can only be tackled together as a planet.
Well, yeah, very well said. And, before I ask you other questions, I was just curious if perhaps, I think it's really interesting. You are, of course, French, but you live in China, you live in
No,
Shanghai.
no one is perfect.
No, I mean, I'm also American, so I hear you. But,
Yeah.
if you could maybe tell us a little bit about yourself, what brought you to China and, what do you do there? And how did you become so political on these issues?
Sure. So, I mean, I'm an entrepreneur. I've always been. I've never worked for someone else. So, when I graduated together with my wife, who is Chinese, in Europe, we created a company. We did the whole startup thing. So we got, VC funding, and we grew very fast, and so on and so forth. The company was called House Trip, and then we had an exit. We sold the company to TripAdvisor. We found ourselves, being able to start a new chapter of our life. And at that point, we wanted children. And we were wondering what was the best place in the world to raise our children. Because we're a mixed couple, me being French and her being Chinese, we wanted our children to be raised in both cultures, to understand both their cultures as natives. That was very important for us. China was pretty much the only place where you could do that, because in China, of course, that Chinese culture around them, but they can also go to French schools, so they can effectively be raised as natives in both cultures. Whereas you can't do the same thing in France. You don't have Chinese schools in France. So that's frankly the main reason why we came to China, and that was 8 years ago. And the reason why I became so political is simply because when I arrived in China and when I started, really understanding the country, I became simply outraged that almost nothing that was told about the country was in the mainstream media was in fact true. A lot of it was, straight lies or gross exaggeration, a lot of prejudices, and so on. And it was simply a feeling of outrage that I had to express. I had to express. So yeah,
That makes sense. No, that makes perfect sense. It's like the reality you're seeing is just not what is being portrayed, especially
yeah,
as this Cold War becomes more insane as the years
yeah,
go on.
yeah.
But that's actually really interesting on like a personal level. But just kind of to move back to the broader issues here, then every week or so, I notice that the mainstream media, as you say, is always kind of portraying things in the wrong way. You'll see a piece published, whether it's in the New York Times or the Washington Post or wherever, where they'll be like pondering why so much of the already food insecure global South just won't get on board with US and European policies and in sanctioning and cutting Russia off from the rest of the world. You know, as if like, well, so what we're talking about, one of the world's, and Russia here, one of the world's biggest producers of grain, of fertilizer. It's like as if it isn't obvious why these countries, especially countries that already have food insecurity problems, wouldn't want to cut off one of their major trading partners with these very vital commodities. And of course, meanwhile, there's this kind of like almost PR campaign by Western officials and Western media to just blame Russia alone for all this growing food insecurity across the global South. Again, as if the sanctions policies have nothing to do with it. And even though, now we see the White House is privately saying that, yes, in fact, they understand now that perhaps cutting off fertilizer is causing a supply shock. It could be driving up food prices. Maybe this is a bad thing for the developing world. At the same time, the White House has been warning countries, particularly African countries, not to purchase, what they're calling stolen Ukrainian grain from Russia. And, all that's to say, how do you understand the growing food crisis as well as these food shortages? And how do you believe they relate to the sanctions on Russia?
Well, it's I haven't really studied this topic in depth, but what you just mentioned, I think, is very noteworthy. I think 3 days ago, I noticed that the White House said that they would prevent the sale of stolen grain from Ukraine. And it's very important to see how they define stolen, because I strongly suspect that they define it as all the wheat harvested from Russian-occupied regions in Ukraine. But the thing is that Russia occupies some of the regions in Ukraine that produce the most wheat. And of course, Ukraine is one of the biggest wheat producers in the world. So effectively, this will mean that the US is preventing the sale of wheat from one of the places in the world that produces the most wheat in the middle of a global food crisis, which is unconscionable when you think about it. So I think when I'm far from a specialist of food and the dynamics around that, I think common sense dictates that the policy should be to set enmities aside and facilitate the distribution of food, no matter the origin, because there are simply too many lives at stake, and it's not something to gamble with in order to own Russia.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, it is amazing too, because obviously, like, no one except for maybe Russia is saying that Russia is blameless here. I mean, obviously they did start a war, so like they blame can be placed on Russia for the consequences of that. But yeah, just the level of just pointing fingers while pretending like your sanctions aren't causing any problems is so absurd. And I raise that to say, like you said, just stating the obvious, right? That's what you did. You stated the obvious. In all of your tweets are really just very nuanced, stating the obvious. What you've written is very nuanced, stating the obvious. Very reasonable takes here. Yet you were recently condemned, or you've also, by the way, I want to point out, you've condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine as an atrocity. Like, all those caveats have been said, yet you still ended up on this insane McCarthyist list. This recent one from the University of Calgary, that was so bizarre. It included other people's names too. I'll pull up what that list looks like. But I'm curious if maybe you could tell us a little bit about this list. What was your reaction when you saw that your Twitter account was included on what they called Russian influenced people? What were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, this list is beyond insane. So first of all, it's quite laughable for me because I have no relationship with Russia. I've never been there. I have no emotional attachment to the country whatsoever.
Here it is, by the way. Here's the list.
Yeah.
It's very, I don't even understand it, by the way. It's like table 1, table 2. Anyways, you're at the bottom of table 2. But anyways, please continue.
Yeah, so it's just bizarre, and you just need to look at some of the other people who are on it together with me. So you have like Glenn Greenwald, which is of course the legendary journalist behind the Snowden revelation. You have John Pilger, another legendary Australian journalist. You have the famous Aaron Mate, whom I guess everyone knows among your audience. So yeah, it's just that tells you what this list is. And then in the study, I don't know if you can put that up, they made this hilarious graph with, on one side, the side of the truth, with... Let
me see if I can find that. These are some images that people tweeted. Let's see. I don't know if I have that one, but you can keep...
Yeah, it doesn't matter. So they had this graph with, on one side, the side of the truth with only 4 people. On those 4 people were Biden, Trudeau, Michael McFaul, who is the former...
oh, God.
Who is the former US ambassador in Russia, on the Ukraine newspaper Kyiv Independent. So that's the truth. On the other side, the side of the lies, were all of us, like Greenwald, Mate. I mean, this says it all, right? When you look at the methodology, what they did is they identified 5 narratives, which, if you propagated them, would land you on the dark side. So 4 of those narratives were mistrust in liberals, mistrust in institutions and elites, NATO expansion, and NATO as an aggressor. So basically, if you have a beef with Western military expansion, and if you mistrust Western elites, to them this means you're somehow a Putin stooge, which is beyond absurd. So, I mean, look at who mistrusts institutional elites in the West in the West today. It's almost everyone. So
Right.
that doesn't make you a Kremlin agent. It makes you just a normal constituted human being. So yeah, this whole thing is just
It's no, I mean, I
ridiculous.
think it goes, yeah, no, it goes along with, I think, a lot of what we're seeing these days with like anybody who challenges these sort of like mainstream narratives, even a little bit, particularly when it comes to Russia and China, is automatically labeled as being some sort of like
Yeah,
nefarious stooge for an authoritarian regime who must be being paid or is like a useful idiot.
mm,
And it's so juvenile, and it's just the way to like put, say, oh, it's just name calling. It's name calling to shut people up, attacking reputations to shut people up.
yeah,
But it's so alarming how many people are buying into it because it is like this like Cold War hysteria. But you also recently pointed out something that I thought was really interesting, which was this quote from Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was, of course, at the State Department under Jimmy Carter, is like was like a foreign policy elite, whose ideas are still very much present in American policy around the world. And the quote that you highlighted was, this is from Zbigniew Brzezinski, not you. But the most dangerous scenario for America would be an anti-hegemonic coalition united not by ideology, but by complementary grievances. And when I saw that, I thought to myself, isn't this what's happening today? Like, that is, you actually do have a growing coalition of countries. And of course, here I'm thinking of countries like China, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, Cuba. These are countries that have almost nothing in common ideologically. Like maybe Venezuela and Cuba do, but certainly Iran, Russia, I mean, these places all have
mm,
very different forms of government, very different economic systems, very different ideologies that form the basis of their societies. Um, but they have been brought together by shared grievances, particularly when it comes to issues of sanctions and just U.S. aggression towards them in various ways. So I guess my question is, how does this relate? Do you think this quote I just mentioned from Zbigniew Brzezinski to the policy goal of preventing this like Eurasian integration of Europe with Russia and China, which is really at the end of the day what this entire US policy around Ukraine, around Taiwan is all about, right? Is to
mm.
prevent this natural integration of these various geographic areas of the world. Which of course Zbigniew Brzezinski was a staunch opponent of. So yeah, how does everything I just said relate to that US goal of preventing Eurasian integration?
Yeah, so this most dangerous scenario that Brzezinski was speaking about is pretty much exactly what is happening. Even a small child can understand this. Is it a smart move to antagonize the largest countries in the world simultaneously? Of course not. It's to be frank, it's very foolish. And the relationship between the West and Russia is at this stage beyond repair. I think it's fair to say, probably for decades. The relationship between the West and China is not as bad, but China is profoundly hurt by the attitude of the West, and there is very little trust left, if not none. And of course, China and Russia now have what they call a no limits friendship. Actually, let me quote you the exact words of the joint statement that they released a couple of months back, which is, friendship between the two states has no limits. There are no forbidden areas of cooperation. So it's an extremely strong statement. But that's not it. You have Iran as well, for instance. In fact, Brzezinski's actual quote is, the most dangerous scenario would be a grand coalition of China, Russia, and perhaps Iran. So, yeah. And yeah, it's not breaking news that Iran isn't exactly on the side of the US. So this is all a consequence of American hubris, frankly. I mean, the arrogance of its actions is breathtaking when you think about it, waging endless wars all over the planet. And when it's not directly at war, it engages in extremely hostile meddling and interference like it constantly does with China or with Russia or Iran for that matter, as well as countless of other countries, maybe even all countries. So you need to be quite deluded to believe that this won't in time create immense resentment and grievances. It's basic physics. For every action, there is an opposite reaction. So it's totally predictable that as their victims pile up, they will at one point congregate and say no more. President Clinton, whom I don't often quote, of, of all people, he actually said something quite smart about this once after he stopped being president. In a 2003 speech at Yale University, he said that if the US could conceive of a world where they will no longer be number one, it was in their interest to create a world with rules and partnerships and habits of behavior that we would like to live in as a relatively smaller power, as number one, number two, as number two, number three, or even less. But they never tried to do this. Instead, they doubled down on hegemony, making up and changing the rules as they went along, so that benefited them. That's what they famously call the rules-based order. And now we're almost in that world. In fact, we're probably already in that world, since China is arguably already number one, like we spoke about earlier. And since the US didn't create a multipolar world order in which they could be a comfortable number two or number three, well, the result is that others are most likely going to take the initiative to create that new world order themselves. It just makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it really is shooting yourself in the foot, but that's what empires do. And speaking of, you're talking about this hubris and this like delusional thinking. I mean, I think that one area where this has certainly been the case has been with Taiwan, especially since Biden became president. He has said, I think at this point 3 times, although every time he says it, then the White House has to walk it back. But he said that the US will intervene militarily if China invades Taiwan. And then we saw in recent months, there was this Politico article that revealed that the US is actually encouraging the Taiwanese government to emulate Ukraine for a future war with China, which sounds just absolutely horrible. Like, why would you encourage any country to emulate Ukraine? Ukraine's being destroyed because of that policy right now. And then, you had mentioned to me earlier, about this quote from Zelensky, where he was quoted in the Washington Post as supposedly having said that there should be a war in Taiwan. This is an article, of course, by Josh Rogan, which you pointed out to me was actually like a misquote of Zelensky, and he wasn't actually saying that. So in that case, not surprising from Josh Rogan, he's sort of known to be just like constantly warmongering in all his pieces and do whatever it takes to get there. But all that aside, why is this policy, this growing encouragement of some sort of war over Taiwan with China, why is this so dangerous? And do you think that the war in Ukraine is making a war in Taiwan over Taiwan more or less likely?
So first of all, we always need to come back to the history of Taiwan. Taiwan, which was part of China, was stolen by Japan and colonized in the end of the 19th century during the so-called Century of Humiliation. Then, when Allies won the Second World War against Japan and China was part of the Allies, Taiwan was retaken by China. But then there was this civil war between the communists on one side, led by Mao, and the KMT on the other side, led by Chiang Kai-shek, who was nicknamed Cash My Check by the Americans for his notorious corruption. And the communists, of course, won the civil war in 1949, despite the KMT having the support of the Americans. and the remnants of the KMT retreated to Taiwan as their last stand. That's basically been the situation ever since. For 30 years, until 1979, the US still recognized the KMT as the official government over the whole of China. The communists just happened to control a small 95% of the territory of the country. But then in 1979, there was the famous Nixon-Kissinger agreement to switch diplomatic relationship, where the government in Beijing became the one government recognized as legitimate over the whole of China, Taiwan included. And during this negotiation, the core ask by the government in Beijing was over Taiwan. It's the very foundation of the relationship with the US. We agree to be in a relationship with you if and only if you recognize us as the sole legitimate government of the whole of China and you consider Taiwan as a province of China. And the condition on the US side was, yes, we agree, but this reunification thing, don't count on it for now. The KMT government remains in place in Taiwan. We won't recognize Taiwan as a country. We won't encourage its independence, but it's also de facto won't be ruled by Beijing. Now, to come back to your question, what Biden is doing is effectively ending the status quo established over 40 years ago, which benefited both the mainland and Taiwan hugely. I mean, look at how they rose both since. China has always been clear that it's committed to peaceful reunification, but that it would intervene militarily for one reason, if Taiwan declared or if it's decisively moved towards independence. And what Biden did with his pledge to defend Taiwan militarily, which, as you pointed out, is not something he said once, but 3 times. And that's the first time a US president makes such a commitment since 1979. And what this does, in effect, is give a green light to the Taiwanese to declare independence because the US has their back. They will protect them if they do so with the most powerful military force on Earth. So that's quite an encouragement. And of course, it's an amazingly dangerous game to play. For China, Taiwan is absolutely non-negotiable because it is so symbolic in so many respects. First, it's an incredibly brutal civil war that was never allowed to end. And second, Taiwan is the last wound from the famous century of humiliation, the territory stolen from China by Japan, which was, of course, China's worst tormentor during that period. So for these reasons, China will never, ever allow Taiwan to become independent. It's simply unthinkable. So with all that being said, sorry, a bit of a long introduction.
No, it's an important history. I'm glad that you summarized that all for us because most people aren't aware of it, but please continue.
So yeah, to come back to your question, does the war in Ukraine make a war in Taiwan more or less likely? I think it makes it reasonably, it should make it less likely. Why? Firstly, because the war in Ukraine revealed the tool set that the West would likely use to defend Taiwan. So basically what they did in Ukraine, so fight China to the last Taiwanese, supply Taiwan with unlimited weaponry, and apply extreme financial sanctions on China. But this revelation in and of itself decreases the risk of war because it's obvious now that the West is almost as much a victim of the sanctions on Russia as Russia itself, if not more, like we discussed earlier. And this is with Russia, an economy which is 10 times smaller than China. So if that's the economic backlash you get from sanctioning Russia, can you even begin to imagine what would be the consequences of similar actions on China, which is like the literal factory of the world? So that's a very strong motivation not to encourage Taiwan to move towards independence. Also, folks in Taiwan and in the neighborhood, they saw what happened to Ukraine and the region. And like you said, who will look at that and want to find themselves in the same situation? In fact, many countries in Asia, like Singapore, for instance, have been vocal that they saw Europe as a counterexample of what not to do. they've seen that it's a very bad idea to foment tension with a great power in the neighborhood. So Taiwan, both from its people and its neighbors, is bound to receive a lot of pressure to maintain the status quo and avoid moving towards independence. Of course, as Biden apparently suggested, there is the likelihood that the US wouldn't act like in Ukraine, but this time will defend Taiwan directly, fight alongside them. But before the war in Ukraine, US military strategists pointed out that Taiwan was indefensible militarily for the US. They systematically lose every war game simulation they make on this. And the war in Ukraine is bound to make a loss even more likely because there is a considerable amount of US military resources and focus right now on Ukraine. And two-front wars are, of course, much harder to win. So again, this is a reason why the US shouldn't encourage Taiwan to trigger a conflict in which they will need to get involved, because that will mean a military loss for them. But frankly, I don't believe the US will get involved militarily. One argument used in Ukraine is that they are not going in because they want to avoid a direct war between nuclear powers, which is a pretty good reason. So the Ukraine war confirmed this red line, and it is unclear why this red line will be broken in Taiwan and not in Ukraine, when Taiwan isn't even officially recognized as an independent country by anyone. And therefore, China moving in wouldn't even be an invasion according to international law. So those are all the logical reasons why the war in Ukraine makes a conflict in Taiwan less likely. But the big question is whether the US and the West in general are still capable of reason.
Yeah, are the people being so stupid as to trigger a war like that? I hope not. But, as this is happening over China, there's something interesting happening around the world, which is the way that China is viewed versus the way that the US is viewed. And, I don't live in the US anymore. So I've noticed this for a very long time. Of course, it's very country specific, but in a lot of the world, the US is viewed as an aggressive player, even by people who like the US. They view it as somewhat of a destructive force, or if not a destructive force, as a force that when it goes to other countries, the US tends to place conditions on its partnership with those countries. Whereas China has a much different relationship with many countries, particularly in the global South. And I think this is reflected in this new poll that was reported by Bloomberg in recent days, that China has actually overtaken the US as the foreign power seen by African youth as having the biggest positive influence. 76% of young Africans across 15 countries named China as a foreign power with a positive influence on their lives, compared with 72% for the US. And that's actually down for the US. It used to be higher, I think, 2 years ago, and how the US was viewed. So why do you think that is the case? Why do you think there's a growing disparity in how people in certain countries may view the US versus how they view China?
First, I think it's because China is simply not the West. It's a global South country like them, and a global South country which A, never colonized them, and B, managed to extirpate itself out of poverty through its own hard work. So in many ways, it is a positive model on the country towards which they have less resentment, as opposed to Western countries, which have inflicted, untold suffering on Africa with colonization, slavery, and even still today, there is a lot of neo-colonization going on. The second reason is probably infrastructure. China isn't paying for the resources it buys from Africa with cash that often benefits the population very little, but by building infrastructure that benefits everyone. So that means that in the eyes of Africans, there are very visible, tangible benefits to working with China, like the road they drive on, the stadium they watch games in, their train stations, and so on and so forth. And lastly, like you said, one aspect is that China is all business, no lecturing. The West will always speak to non-Western nations from a position of superiority with a frankly patronizing savior complex. And I believe this lecturing is increasingly inaudible and unacceptable to countries in Africa who just want to find their own way, build their own civilization, and become countries that fit their own values and traditions. All the more because the West is less and less seen as a model itself. Like, why tell us we're less good than you and we need to change to become more like you when things are clearly not working so well for you? And China does nothing of that. It never tries to convert people to becoming Chinese. The very idea of that is like laughable to any Chinese. Like, Chinese people are Chinese and no one else can be Chinese. So there is zero proselytism in Chinese culture, which I reckon is very much part of the reason why people in Africa see China as a more benign power than the US.
Yeah, and China also tends to like build stuff, right? Like that's another thing too. They build infrastructure, whereas the US doesn't do. The US doesn't build infrastructure anywhere unless it's like to build a bigger embassy, or you know what I mean? It's never
or a military base.
Exactly, or a military base. And just to add to this view, or the view, I guess maybe not of China, but views inside China. I think this is interesting too. And you actually did a nice Twitter thread on this recently. There's this fascinating study that was released, I think, last week by the Alliance of Democracies Foundation, which, as you pointed out, was actually founded by a former NATO Secretary General. So you can believe what they say. It's okay. What they say is okay. It's not Russian propaganda. No,
they're in the camp of the good.
Exactly. They're on the side of good. But this pretty lengthy set of questions that were asked in countries around the world found that of all places where they went and polled people, it was people in China that perceived their country as the most democratic. And it was so different than, and we don't consider, in the West at least, we don't consider China a traditional democracy like the way that the Western countries are democracies. And it was just interesting because it was like people inside of China mostly thought that their country is in fact a democracy, whereas you had the opposite response from many people in countries like the US and France and all of these Western countries that we consider to be democracies. So can you tell us, I guess, a little bit about what you found interesting, perhaps about the results from this study? And how is it, what were the biggest differences you saw? And why do you think in China so many people view their country as being a democracy versus in other places like the US?
This study is fascinating because it really calls into question what democracy actually is. In the study, I think the 5 countries that viewed themselves as the most democratic in the world were in order: China, Switzerland, Vietnam, India, and Norway. And some countries which claim to be shining examples of democracies, like the US or France, my country, are actually not seen by their own people as democratic. Less than half of Americans and less than half of French actually believe that their country is democratic. And when you look at the details of the study, whether people believe they live in a democracy or not, essentially boils down to 3 big factors. One, whether the government is perceived as serving a minority or the majority. 2, whether people believe in the country think that everyone has equal rights. And 3, whether government policy is aligned with what people want. When you consider this explains much better why people in China believe they live in a democracy. So on the minority versus majority aspect of things, if you look at it, the 2 big initiatives of the Chinese government over the past 10 years have been poverty alleviation and clamping down on corruption. And you could add things like infrastructure development or even zero COVID. All this is clearly done for the greater good, not to serve the interests of the few. And on believing that everyone has equal rights, the clampdown on corruption also probably helped with that. Just recently, they found a top official who would give insider trading tips to his close family members. The guy was given the death penalty. With reprieve, which means he won't actually be killed, and he will, but he will have life in prison. Meanwhile, you've probably heard of Paul Pelosi, Nancy Pelosi's husband, who's been surprisingly successful at trading. One of the best traders.
He must just have like a natural skill or something, right?
Like a real genius. And nothing happened there. So all this participates to create an image, in the case of China, of a state that is extremely rigorous on accountability by top officials. In the case of the US, of a state that's, to say the least, much less keen on accountability. And China has also notoriously held its billionaire class accountable, and it's probably the only state in the world that does that. So again, it gives the image of a country where no one is too powerful or too rich to avoid accountability. And the most interesting part of the study is on elections. What's interesting is that many countries don't see themselves as democracies. Many of the countries that don't see themselves as democracies believe that there are free and fair elections. Like in France, people say, yes, we have free and fair elections, but we don't have democracy. So it shows that deep down, even if when you ask people, they often say that democracy is about elections, deep down, they don't actually believe that. They know that to be a democracy, there needs to be much more than the simple act of voting. It all comes back to me to the famous Abraham Lincoln sentence, of the people, by the people, for the people. Elections is only encompassed in the by the people bit, but if you can't elect true representatives of the people who then act for the people, then there is no point in elections, frankly. And in the US, for instance, there are several studies, like one made by Princeton in 2014, that show that the government clearly doesn't act for the people. In fact, that Princeton study concluded that what average citizens want has, I quote, little or no influence on US policy, which is crazy. So all in all, yes, it was a fascinating study which raises very deep questions and will call for profound governance changes in a certain number of countries if they actually listen to their people.
Right. And that Princeton study I think you mentioned basically suggests that the US is actually an oligarchy, where moneyed interests control basically everything.
Yeah.
I know I've taken a lot of your time, so I just have a few more questions here. And this is, I guess, the most controversial for last, or the most controversial topic for last. And that's, of course, the topic of Xinjiang. And, of course, I think everybody probably who watches this program is familiar with the name Adrian Zenz. Of course, this is the German researcher who's been accused of being a fraud. In some cases has been proven to be a fraud. But, regardless, Adrian Zenz has been embraced by the Western mainstream for pushing the whole Xinjiang genocide narrative, despite major holes in his claims and research. And of course, he was recently in the news again because he wrote a new journal article based on what has been referred to as the Xinjiang Police Files, which was published in the Journal of the European Association for Chinese Studies last month. And so many, like I mentioned, many of our viewers will be familiar with Adrian Zenz, but for those who maybe aren't, can you explain why this person might not be the best source on these things? And then perhaps we can get to the issues in his latest report.
Sure. So first of all, Adrian Zenz works for the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. So already, So what that is an anti-communist propaganda outlet created by an act of the U.S. Congress. So already at that stage, it should be clear that we are not exactly dealing with an impartial actor here. And also, like you said, he's been caught several times being extremely manipulative with his data. The best example is probably when he was trying to argue that there was widespread sterilization taking place in Xinjiang, he made the claim that, and I will quote him here, 80% of all net added IUD is uterine devices, so to
birth control, yeah.
Yeah, birth control, exactly. So 80% of all net added IUD placements in China were performed in Xinjiang in 2018. And any normal person will understand this as, whoa, like 80% of all IUDs in China in 2018 were placed on women in Xinjiang, which would be shocking because, you know, Xinjiang is one of the biggest provinces of China, but 80% is still a crazy high number. And in fact, that's the way most media and politicians who spread this from them understood it and the way they reported on it. But it was a trick. Notice that he said net added IUD placements and not simply IUD placements. The net added bit is a statistical sleight of hand. It's a totally meaningless number. When you calculate the actual percentage of IUDs that in 2018 were placed on women in Xinjiang is just 8%, which is 10 times less. So he keeps doing tricks like this over and over again. Another one is that one big proof for the genocide that he always pushes is that Xinjiang birth rates dropped rapidly at some point, which is true, but there is a very logical explanation for it, which he always leaves out, which means he lies by omission. The thing about Uyghurs and all ethnic minorities in China, for that matter, is that they were never subject to the one-child policy. Only Han's where the one-child policy was dropped and then in 2017 the same family planning policy was made universal for all ethnicities. It became 2 children per couple for people living in cities, 3 for people living in rural areas. So from that point onward, everyone in China, regardless of their ethnicity, was treated the same. So Uyghurs went from effectively being allowed to have as many children as they wanted to having restrictions. And Han's went from being allowed to have only 1 child to being allowed to have 2 or 3. And guess what happened? Uyghur birth rates dropped to become the same as those of the Han. Which makes perfect sense, right?
So on this topic, of course, of the report that just came out, there was also some new drama over the UN Human Rights Chief. She had to resign from her post following a big backlash over a visit to Xinjiang by essentially the UN. She was leading it, where it seems, whatever she witnessed may refute claims perhaps from Western countries and their NGOs and people like Adrian Zenz of genocide. So what are your thoughts on this particular resignation?
So, I obviously don't know the ins and outs of the reason Bachelet resigned, but one must admit that it's an interesting coincidence. So she goes to Xinjiang. She was the first UN human rights chief to do so, to finally see with her own eyes what's going on. I believe she stayed 7 days in China. And finally, at the end of her visit, she reported things in a way which I think can be characterized as balanced. So on the one hand, she said that China had, some impressive achievements in terms of human rights, like poverty alleviation. It's not nothing. They lifted 800 million out of poverty. And she said she went to Xinjiang, she visited the prison, and she visited vocational education and training center, which is what the Western media call re-education camps. She basically framed China's implementation of those centers as policies to counter terrorism and radicalism, which is what the Chinese have been saying all along. So it arguably shows that she believes the Chinese take on the rationale for this program. But she wasn't all praise. She said she had concerns about, I will quote her here, like the lack of independent judicial oversight of the operation of the program, the reliance by law enforcement officials on 15 indicators to determine the tendency towards violent extremism, and so on and so forth. So she had a list of, human rights concerns. So yeah, fairly balanced take. She also said that the Chinese government assured her that the centers had been all closed down, which is something that several Uyghurs here in China told me as well, which the Chinese government has been saying for a couple of years. What she didn't say, though, is that genocide was going on, which means that most likely she doesn't believe in it. And frankly, for anyone who knows a bit about Xinjiang and is a bit intellectually honest, it's frankly an insane thing to believe. So what do you know? After a visit, and after she said all that, all the U.S. government affiliated NGOs were calling for resignation because obviously they were annoyed that she hadn't legitimated the genocide narrative that they had been peddling. And a few days after, she does resign. So it is a strange coincidence.
Just a bit, yeah. And then I'm curious, since you are in China, how is the accusation of genocide in Xinjiang perceived in China as far as the people you've talked to?
So I think pretty much everyone I've met here sees it as like the weaponization of human rights, so the tool to fight China and to justify hostile actions against China. So we will do this new law because of Xinjiang. We will do those new sanctions because of Xinjiang, and so on and so forth. And look, I'm not saying that Uyghurs had an easy time in China. Those training centers did exist, and Xinjiang became a province with very intense security measures, cameras and checkpoints everywhere. Every knife in the province had to be recorded with the police, even kitchen knives, and so on and so forth. So the Chinese are not kidding with terrorism. They really went all in to secure the place after the terrorist attacks. And it worked. I mean, 0 terrorist attacks since the measure. But there is a massive difference between heavy security measures and the genocide. The Uyghurs are still there. Let me give you a very telling quote by Dr. Michael Pillsbury, who is the architect of Trump's China policy. On those genocide accusations arose when he was part of the administration, and even he doesn't believe in it. He says, and I quote him here, "Nobody has found a dead Uyghur who was killed through some kind of deliberate mechanism." In other words, he doesn't believe a single Uyghur has been killed. So how on earth can you call that a genocide? And what people don't realize is that there are Uyghurs all over China, not just in Xinjiang. I've been personally going to the same Uyghur restaurant in the center of Shanghai for over 15 years. The place has not changed. It's still managed and staffed by the same Uyghur family. I spoke with them about what the West was saying, and they laughed about the genocide accusation. They knew about those training centers. They knew some people who had been in them. But they also confirmed to me that they believed at this stage they'd all been closed down. So to answer your question, I think no other accusation has hurt the Chinese more deeply than this one. It's a pretty big deal to accuse people of committing genocide, which is the most serious crime on earth. And the effect, as far as I can see, is immense resentment towards the West for daring to make those types of accusations, which no one in China believes is grounded in truth. And especially, this is China, a country where you never ever make negative accusation against someone in public unless you want to cement a very deep hostility towards you. It's the famous concept of face. You always say negative things in private. So if the West wanted to fuel Chinese nationalism and animosity towards them, it was the single best thing to do. But if they wanted to induce change in China, to make the Chinese people open to what they had to say, it was the single worst thing to do.
Yeah. And there's something so incredibly ironic about officials from a country that, in response to a massive terrorist attack, launched a global war and literally destroyed several countries, are actually still in the process of destroying some of those countries as a result of an attack that happened, over 20 years ago now. Yet, you can't, I mean, it's not even comparable. Like whatever, whatever China's reaction may have been to attacks, whether right or wrong, it does not compare to the level of terror the U.S. inflicted around the world because of an attack in the U.S. It's just, it really is mind-boggling that the same people behind those policies can then go and say that, oh, how dare China do anything in response, and they're overreacting. And maybe they are, but just coming from the U.S., wow. I want to thank you for coming on and giving me an hour of your time and going through all these various topics. I really appreciate it. Where can people follow you?
So on Twitter, I'm Arnaud Bertrand. So maybe I should spell that because
I'll put it. I'll add it. I'll add it to the
you
description so people can find it in the description. And you are really quite a prolific tweeter, and you're an important account because I
tweet. If you listen to my wife, I tweet way too much, and she's probably right.
Well, no, I actually appreciate it because I actually find news items that I might have not otherwise seen from your Twitter account. So I appreciate all those tweets. Thanks. But thank you so much for joining me, and I hope we can have you on at some point in the future to talk about even more.
Great.